Good afternoon, everyone. This is session 3, and we're going to be talking about ethics and the IRB. My name is Leigh Lamonica. I'm the director of the Ethics and Regulatory Knowledge Core in CaTS, and I'm happy to help y'all with this topic. So today we're going to have our agenda is that learning the basic principles of research ethics, the IRB requirements for academic and community partnerships, and a review of just the fundamentals of IRB procedures and protocols. So after this webinar, we hope that you will be able to describe the 5 ethical principles of research, find how to submit an IRB within your institution, and identify the trainings that you will need in order to ensure the protection of human subjects. First topic I want to talk about is being legal versus ethical. So while being legal means operating within the law, ethics does not always mean that. It means what's doing right. So whether it's legal and it's ethical is not always the same thing. So you can have something that is legal and ethical. You can also have something that is legal but yet unethical. And you can have things that are illegal but might be ethical. And then you have things that are both illegal and unethical. This creates some gray areas for some situations. So I just wanted to make sure that you are aware as a researcher that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. And that's why you have 2 separate components of ethics and regulatory in this core. So for IRB regulations and the ethical concept of research, this all stems from a document called the Belmont Report, which includes the ethical principles that are mandatory for an IRB to consider when they're considering the protection of human research participants. These are benefits, respect for persons, justice, non-malfeasance, and utility. And we're going to talk about these in depth in just a second. So benefits. Benefits is that there is an obligation to benefit the participant in a clinical trial and those being served by the study. So think of it as, because benefits isn't really a word we use anymore, but it's really the kindness, the generosity, something that you're going to get back by participating in the study. Respect for the person, your autonomy. The IRB is going to look to see whether the study protects and preserves the person's individual autonomy and how it does that while the person is participating in the clinical research. Justice. Justice is to make an impartial and fair decision on the administrative matters of the protocol and anybody that might be affected by the protocol. You need to balance the competing priorities, such as the benefits or the burdens, the risks and the costs to the participant or the institution. Both things can be discussed at the IRB level when they're reviewing a protocol. But most importantly, the IRB is looking for the protection of participants. Non-malfeasance. So this is, again, in clinical care, you're thinking of a physician or other healthcare providers saying, do no harm. We're not trying to harm anyone by having them participate in these clinical research studies. And then the utility. You're trying to find out what the action that's evaluated in terms of its effect, rather than it's something that's intrinsic attributes. So again, it's the greatest good for the greatest number, and it's a consequence-based action. So when an IRB reviews a protocol, they're looking at all 5 of these principles to determine whether the protocol should go forward or whether there should be some modifications to the protocol to better protect the participants in light of these 5 principles. So an IRB, the goal of the IRB is to protect the human subjects, the research participants, from the physical and psychological harm for the review of the protocols. Now, the history behind IRBs is this was mandated in the US in particular by the National Research Act of 1974. So as many of you may know, there were some historical situations in which people did not follow ethical and legal research practices. So the US government decided that we needed to go ahead and codify that in law, and they did so in the National Research Act. So now all research that involves humans must be reviewed to assess the participants' welfare, rights, and privacy. They must ensure that all of these things are respected in light of how the protocol is set up. So who is this IRB? Well, an IRB is comprised of at least 5 members, one of whom is outside of the research institution and one of whom is a non-scientist. IRBs can be of greater size and varying disciplines, but this is the bare minimum of the membership of an IRB. The IRB is also an organization outside of the institution. While it might sit within the institution, its power is derived from the law and not through the institution. So the IRB is empowered to approve, disapprove, monitor, or make modifications to any of the studies under its jurisdiction. So for example, an institution can't approve research that the IRB has disapproved. So out of the National Research Act, the Department of Health and Human Services created the Common Rule, and that's the set of regulations which has been developed to ensure the research compliance within the principles of the Belmont Report. Originally, it was started through the Department of Health and Human Services, but then other federal departments have adopted those regulations as well to regulate their forms of human research. The Common Rule was also recently updated in 2018 to kind of modernize it, and there's still some discussions ongoing on further modifications to the Common Rule. But you'll hear that when we're talking about human subjects research and the regulations that apply, the Common Rule is what's going to be cited. So when a participant is going to enroll into a study, they're going to be more likely than not. There's some situations where an informed consent document might not be applicable, but most of the time, an informed consent document is going to be required by the IRB. In this document, the participants must be told transparently several things. Number one, the purpose of the study. You can't hide what you're trying to do. Then they have to know what happens during the study, whether they're going to be subjected to procedures, drugs, devices, surveys, anything that's going to happen them throughout the study, they have to know about before signing that document, before agreeing to participate in the study. And realize that informed consent, while you may think about it as the piece of paper that the participant signs, it's a process that goes on throughout the study. It's not limited to that one time where you hand it to the participant. So additionally, you want to talk about any benefits, if there are any, that can be reasonably expected, any choices that the person may have, and what happens if they decide not to partake in the study. So for example, you can't condition your treatment of X disease on the fact that they won't participate in the study, or they will participate in the study. You want to outline with specificity what compensation the participant will receive and what charges, if any, the participant will be required to pay. In most cases, research in itself doesn't require the participant to pay, but there can be some situations where research and standard of care are commingled, and certain procedures might be considered standard of care, and the participant might be responsible for those. Then also about any medical treatments, what are available to a participant if there are complications that occur from participating in the protocol. Moving on, so you have to assure them in the informed consent how the study records will be maintained confidential to the extent allowed by law. Obviously, there are some situations in which the government, the sponsor of the study, oversight organizations have access to the information, the confidential information, but there are specific exceptions for those being able to look at those records. The participant also has the right to receive a copy of the records outside of the research, especially when it's done. There may be some times when the participant is blinded, so therefore you can't provide certain types of records. But after the conclusion of the research, you would need to provide those documents, those medical records. In the informed consent, it's important to tell the participant if there's going to be any new findings about the willingness to participate. So say the study's ongoing and it's about a device and the sponsor or the study has shown that there's some additional risks. Well, then you'd have to update the informed consent to provide the participant that information about those new risks. And their willingness to continue in the study despite those new risks. They also need to be able to ask questions during the study before giving consent and at any time during the study period. This goes back to my saying that informed consent is a continuous process. It is. Every time the participant comes into the clinic or wherever they're being seen, they have the right and should be offered to have any of their questions answered or, to go over anything they would like to go over again. Again, in that process, you want to make sure that they have ample time to consider their alternatives, ample time so they can understand the document that they're about to sign without pressure to decide whether to consent to participate. In some cases, studies choose to send the consent home early so that the person can read the consent before they come for their first visit or their screening visit. And that way that helps the participant have as much time as they need with that document. So there's also situations in which this participant might not be the made for the study, might not, have the right qualifications or disease state. The informed consent should outline those exclusions so where we can refuse for the participant to participate, we as the study team. And then they can also have their own options to refuse to participate, decide they don't want to participate in the study as well. All of that should be outlined in the informed consent. And lastly, each participant should sign and date the copy of the informed consent, and they should be given a copy of that for their own records. Okay. So the common rule, which is part of the Code of Federal Regulations, which has the regulations that, embody the IRB requirements, which contains the regulations for the informed consent document, also outlines